all of Scripture, incredibly well known even in pop culture. A passage that if folks, that even as they're aware of the content of the poem that we'll look at this morning, they are most commonly probably not aware that it's from the Bible and don't really have that comprehension, certainly don't necessarily understand its meaning and its importance. And so this morning we're going to spend our time in Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 15. You'll see in just a moment the poem runs from verses 1 through 8. And then what Solomon, or the teacher, Koheleth, does is he unpacks or goes back and evaluates his own poem, almost a form of poetical criticism. Let me then figure out how this applies. And he does that in two separate sections. He does it in verses 9 through 15, and then he looks at it from another angle, beginning in verse 16 of chapter 3. And the truths he starts to develop in that second one actually run into chapter 4. So we're going to look at the poem a little bit and just look at that first evaluation this morning. Then we'll spend our time back in the poem again a little bit, but then looking at the second evaluation next week. By way of introduction, maybe it'd be helpful if you just got your brains going this way. About 200 years after Solomon wrote this chapter, after he sat down and wrote Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there was this lonely prophet in Israel just sitting in his house. He had just put the kids down for a nap, and he was sitting there thinking about his life. Finally, the home was a little quiet for a few minutes. No one was actually listening very much to him, certainly not the people he was prophesying to, and frankly, like lots of parents of very, very small children, felt like maybe not even kids were listening to him. Certainly his wife wasn't listening to him. Frankly, though, naming your kids, his 3 children, he named one of them after a city that was a site of tremendous defeat for Israel. He named another one No Mercy, because he was saying people were getting no mercy from God. And he named his 3rd child Not My People, because God was saying you're not my people anymore. That doesn't really endear you to your neighbors. And so the prophet was feeling increasingly isolated. His own wife Gomer has abandoned him. He didn't even know where she was at this point in time. His own wife he's a prophet of God, and she has given herself to prostitution at this point. And so he gets it. He gets why he feels so alone, why he feels so isolated. But how on earth was all this supposed to work anyway? I mean, what was God's plan in this mess? There was immense sorrow and struggle in his heart and his life. Everywhere he turned, he was exhausted. Why didn't God at least take the love for his wife out of his heart? I mean, he had frequently prayed, if God would just take away my love for Gomer, then it would hurt a whole lot less. It would blunt the pain. Why did No Mercy have to have blonde hair when his and his wife's were so clearly very dark? Just a constant reminder, wasn't even his child. Didn't God know and understand that this endless cycle of sin and in raising up a judge or a prophet to judge the nation didn't work anyway? I mean, God surely understood what Hosea knew. Moses, Samuel, Nathan, Shemaiah, Obadiah, Joel, Isaiah, and Micah, they hadn't gotten anywhere. He was just another failed prophet in a long line of failed prophets. It was just this endless cycle. Hard work, nobody listening, painful circumstances, all to be repeated again and again and again. And in his own life, a cycle of wandering wife, returning wife, wandering wife, returning wife, endless pain, neighbors rejoicing she's returned, only to turn a skeptical eye when she leaves once again. He better just shut his eyes and try to get some sleep while the kids were napping. What will he do then? Well, he'll do the same thing when they wake up that he did the day before, and that he'll do tomorrow, and that he'll do next week and next month. He will wipe noses, make food, put kids to bed, discipline children endlessly, and wonder what is the point. As he shut his tired eyes, a smile did creep across his face as he remembered how Not My People and their perpetual runny nose had sneezed at the table and blown the hugest snot bubble he'd ever seen, and all the kids had giggled. It was the one smile point he had of his whole day. As sleep crept into Hosea's heart, what is the point of the endless cycles of life? Seemingly meaningless cycles, whether it's in the lives that we live or in the ministries God has called us to, we really feel like we're trapped in time. And Hosea the prophet is a great picture of someone that I've got to believe in reading Ecclesiastes would have resonated with him. I think any of us that are going through seasons of sorrow, struggling, or suffering, It resonates with us and the seeming futility of it. And so this morning we're really going to understand this truth. We need to let the futile cycles of life drive us to joy and worship as we reflect on God's rule over all of life. The teacher has made a significant claim. Coming out of chapter 2, he said that part of the reason work is meaningless in finding value in life or putting meaning in life, work or pleasure, is because time will end it. Time will make it to go away, and it's all going to be repeated anyway. And so he now starts to think about life and time in general. And so Ecclesiastes 3 is now trying to find meaning in the cycle of life and trying to find purpose just overall in this time box that God has placed us into, the seeming hemming in of our lives. As I said, the poem is verses 1 through 8. Then verses 9 through 15 are one evaluation of the poem, and then verses 16 through 22 are another. And so if you look down your Bibles, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I'm going to read the poem first, and then we'll start working at understanding it. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, some of you automatically remember and recognize some of those, and some of you are reaching in your brains and thinking, where do I know that from? Some of you automatically know that has been made popularized by a folk rock group, the Byrds, in the 1960s. Song written by Peter Seeger. He actually just basically took these verses, and other than shifting a few words to make them rhyme, it's almost word for word all the way through. The one major exception is he leaves out a time for war. And so the Byrds make this song, and it actually hits number 1 on the charts and for a long period of time. But it didn't stop there. I mean, if we go back, and some of you are familiar with that, and some of you are like, I don't even know. Some of you thought it was the Beatles. No, it was the Byrds. And so you're like, what? But it didn't stop there. As a matter of fact, since that time, the song has been covered over 65 times by other groups, including the vocals. If you include the instrumentals, you go over 100. If you include other languages, you're well over 100. German, French, and Spanish, just to name 3 of them. It's been covered by groups in different genres, from everything from Ricky Skaggs to Emmylou Harris to Dolly Parton to a Catholic nun known as the Singing Nun. Bruce Springsteen did a version of it. And then most recently, in 2018, a group called Anthem Lights, it's a Christian a cappella group, did a cover of the song. In other words, the song has lasted from every available generation we have in front of us, from your baby boomers to your millennials. It's been popular every single generation. Almost every musical style. There are classical versions of it, and then folk rock and country and just folk country. The only genre I didn't see, honestly, was death metal or rap have covered it yet. So here, there's a gap. Somebody can make some money out there, I guess. But it transcends time. It transcends generation. It transcends genre or even musical preference or what you would like. It's surprising how popular it is. What's unfortunate is people stop there, and they don't even understand the meaning of it. And Koheleth, the teacher, he gives us this poem, but honestly, the most important part of chapter 3 begins at verse 9, as he starts to unpack the poem and understand what he's actually communicating. And so let me just give you some basic facts about the poem that he gives that'll help us to understand maybe why it's so transcendent over time. There are 14 couplets in the text there. There are 28 specific aspects of life that the teacher covers. It's formed in what we call a merismus. Now hang in there, that's not an overly complex word. You actually already know examples of merismus if you're familiar at all with some titles of God. God is commonly known as what? The Alpha and the Omega. Well, you don't have to know Greek, right? The Greek alphabet to know that's beginning and end. Well, merismus is that kind of communication. Let me start at the beginning, and I'm going to give you the end. Well, is that all that we're saying about God? He's only the beginning, and he's only the end. No. A merismus says he's the beginning and the end is a way of saying that he's everything in between. And so the merismus here, when it says a time to be born and a time to die, it's communicating, yes, a time to be born, but all of your life included until the time you die. A time to sow, and all of the work of watering and weeding and looking after and hoping and praying that there'll be sun and rain and not too much sun and not too much rain, and then finally reaping and harvesting. It's everything. And so it's a merismus. And so what's important for us about that is the teacher is intending to cover all of life, all of your existence, and frankly, every human's existence. The reason it turned into a song, it has been so prescient, whether it is baby boomers or folk rock to a cappella Christian group stripped of music and focused solely on the lyrics of millennials, is because it doesn't matter if you're baby boomer or Generation X or millennial. It speaks to your existence and mine. It doesn't matter that we're a couple thousand years removed from Solomon writing. It's his existence. It's our existence. It's Hosea's existence. And it's our existence. Finally, another important detail is there's 7 pairs of pairs. In Hebrew poetry, it functions very different than the way we think of English poetry with things like rhyming and meter and patterns, and all their meter and patterns were very, very different from ours. We only think of poetry when it works well as some kind of rhyming, consistent structure. Even Asian haikus, there's a sense of meters and structure, and Hebrew poetry is very different. But one of the things Hebrew poetry would do when it was communicating about divine was it loved this number 7, this number of perfection and of completion. And the fact that there's 7 pairs of pairs, the fact that it's merismus, these are hints to us. The teacher's telling us, I'm talking about every single person's life who ever reads this. Boy, girl, man, woman, grandparent, single, widow, never married, worker, retired, newborn, someone in hospice care. It's everything about everybody in all of their life. And so that's why it's so powerful. It resonates with our experience. We begin to read it, and you find yourself somewhere there. It's speaking directly to your heart. And so as the poem begins to develop, there's a couple of themes that are important to understand about it. First of all, the poem is about time. No word shows up more frequently than the word time, and we could think of it as season of life even. There's a season to cast away stones and a season to gather stones together. And so it's all about time. And you're starting to get some hints about the frustration of time. You'll see this in his evaluation, that there's a feeling of being trapped in time as this never-ending cycle keeps happening. 1,000 years ago, there were parents exhausted from dealing with kids. 2,000 years ago, there were people that feel like they had moved past the peak of their life and were trying to figure out what's been the purpose. 3,000 years ago, there were young people that couldn't wait to get some freedom and independence to live out their own lives and figure things out for themselves. This cycle just keeps happening and happening and happening, and as time continues, it will keep happening. You know, even in the pandemic that we're in, one of the things I've commonly said to people is there's no template for the decisions a church can make here. Now, what I don't mean by that is that there aren't truths in the Bible to guide the decisions we make. I absolutely don't mean that at all. Loving God, loving others, filled with faith and not fear, walking circumspectly, caring for our neighbors, submission to government, submission to church authority, ministering and caring mostly for the weak and the vulnerable. These are all things. But what I'm saying is there's no template that says meet this day, meet at this time, this number of people, this is how you do it. The closest we can even go to, and lots of pastors have done this, including your pastors, is think back to how did the world deal with the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic? What are lessons we could learn then? But even that has its limitations. Over 100 years ago, medical science has radically changed, and the political structure of our country has radically changed. So how do we make these decisions? Well, guess what? The churches back then didn't know what to do either. But the reality of pandemics coming is going to continue. And so while we feel like we're in a new season, it's a repeated season. And if the Lord tarries, it'll happen again. at another time, in another way, maybe not in our part of the globe, but certainly somewhere in the globe. So the poem is about time. There is a bit of frustration about it. It's a little bit similar in the words he chooses are rough and ready, a little bit hard-hitting. So in that way, it's reminiscent of Psalm 139. It's a favorite psalm of people about God's comfort. The psalmist in Psalm 139 says at one point, God has hemmed me in from before and behind. Lots of people think that sounds like a security blanket. God has covered me and he holds me tight. The psalmist in Psalm 139 at that point in the psalm structure is not happy about that. He feels trapped by God, not excited about it. And so he's communicating truth, but out of a genuine heart of frustration. And so is the teacher here. And so the poem is about time. The poem is about the good and the bad. And I think that's obvious. We'd all rather have birth than death. The Hortons welcomed I got to see him yesterday. Haley and I were able to drop a little gift off for them, some bread Beth Ann made. And he is a cutie. I mean, this is a good-looking little boy and brand new baby. And there's nothing like new baby, right? Like I'm a baby guy. I love babies. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a baby doctor. And so just a beautiful little baby boy. We'd all rather have birth. And then I find out yesterday that my oldest uncle on my dad's side has been diagnosed with a very significant disease. And there's no cure, and it's progressive, and he's already struggling physically, and death is probably coming. And I remember this uncle particularly for being always very kind and generous to me, taking me crabbing, and he gave us our first model railroad set, my brother and I, and he would always give us birthday gifts very generously. And what I remember most is the lesson actually Will preached a few weeks ago on the mustard seed. To this day, as a little fourth grader, I remember sitting in my uncle as my Sunday school teacher teaching me about this. Well, we'd all rather have birth than death. But at the same time, birth brings pain. And it's hard, and it's scary, and it's difficult, and it results in sleepless nights. You lose more sleep, new parents lose more sleep the first year of a baby's life than surgical residents who famously go sleepless. So birth is joy, but it does come with struggles. And frankly, death is sorrowful, but for the believer, many times it's sweet release, isn't it? And so there is the good and there is the bad. You think about casting away stones. Well, there's a season in a good way to clear the field of stones. But then there's a season to gather those stones into a wall to protect the same field you were just dealing with. And so it's about the good and the bad, and it's not necessarily basing judgment. These are the good, these are the bad. We'd rather have peace than war. But if war is the only means to stop a fascist genocidal government in World War II, then you'd rather have war than fake peace. And so the poem is dealing with all these cycles without necessarily making a judgment on what is good and what is bad. That's important to know so that as you read through it, you're not trying to say, oh, God is saying this is better than that, and so then how do I work through the seasons of life? A third reality about the poem, it is the normative existence. There's even the emotional response to it. There are many things in the poem that we do. There are many things that we just experience, and then there are some things we feel. There is a time to mourn, and we go through seasons of life where we mourn, and we go through seasons of life where there's laughter. We go through seasons of life where we hug and we embrace, and there's love and affection, and we go through seasons of life where social distancing is the best way to love somebody. And so it's all about our life. There's a time to do the hard work of building something new, but sometimes you have to do the hard work of tearing something down before you can do the building of something new. There's the couple that is excited and at their wedding is opening up all their wedding gifts. And it's the same couple that 5 years later is having a yard sale, selling most of them to buy a new crib for the baby they're expecting. And so it's just the seasons of life, and the normal existence of our life is what he's trying to get after. If you ever find yourself in a spot where you're like, I just don't know that God understands what I'm going through, a great poem to read would be come back here just to remind your heart that God understands the normal existence of life. And then lastly, to just understand the poem is about God's sovereignty. Many people stop at the song or the lyrics or just these first 8 verses. But the most critical portion, as I said, begins at verse 9. And look at, if you see what he says here in verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? The reflection on all the cycles of life, it leads the teacher to say this, essentially. Then what's the point of my life? And what's the point of this season? And what's the point of this time? And why am I going through this? And why am I experiencing this? And what does it all really matter? There's the sense of time, but being trapped in time. There's things that are true for every human. What's the real point of my life and all this hard work that I've done? Everything done before will be done again, and anything I do or you do will be redone, done over, or done away with. We don't have Solomon's temple. We don't have Solomon's gardens. We don't have Solomon's private forest of fruit trees. It's gone. Thousands of hours of work, attention, effort, money, gone. Never to be revisited. My guess is the little campground in West Virginia I used to go to with my grandparents, and I remember watching my uncles and my dad sweat in the summer heat and build this gazebo and tease one another as brothers will. And I remember as a little boy watching them build this gazebo, and many summer nights from that point forward, a whole family gathering in West Virginia, sitting around a bonfire under this gazebo. I guarantee you it doesn't stand to this day. And so everything will go away. What is the point? Changing light bulbs, making a bed, taking out the trash, routine maintenance, disciplining children, annual reviews, cold and flu season, and on and on and on. Is there any meaning in life when it's trapped in these cycles of time? And this is what the teacher's saying. God is sovereign over all of these. So, if God is sovereign over all of these things that are happening in time, and they nevertheless seem pointless, then what's it all matter? What's the benefit? And so then that leads us to be able to start unpacking what he's going to say, and you're really going to get a greater sense of his frustration, verses 9 through 11. So turn your attention there. He says this, what gain has the worker from his toil? I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. In other words, our life, all the things of our life. And he says this interestingly, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The work and the pleasure of this life are but a blip on the eternal timeline that God has given to us. It's important that we understand how we think about time to even comprehend the struggle of the teacher here. Researchers have studied the way we think about time, the way we function, and one article from Thought Company captures it well. It says it this way: time seems to slow down during emergencies or danger. It's not that we actually have a superhuman ability that in an emergency everything goes into slow motion, chariots of fire music plays, like that's not what happens. But we sense it like things seem to have slowed down. And so scientists at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston say the brain doesn't actually speed up, but the amygdala becomes more active. The amygdala is the region of your brain and my brain that make memories. As more memories form, time seems drawn out. The same phenomena explains why older folks seem to perceive time as moving much faster than when they were younger. Psychologists believe the brain forms more memories of new experiences than memories of familiar ones. Since fewer new memories are built later in life, time seems to pass more quickly. In other words, what's interesting is then what works against us as we get older. So say your family has a particular tradition, and you do that every year at the same time. Guess what? As you get older, you will remember it far less accurately. And it will seem to be much more fleeting to you than it was at the beginning. So if you want time to slow down, build newer memories. Build more memories. Pack in memories. And it will make it seem to slow down. But just to be honest with you, none of us will be able to fight the perpetual. Every cycle will seem the same. I turn 46 this coming week, and I will already tell you, I've lived through enough presidential cycles, they all feel the same to me at this point. It's like, let's just get to November, get it done with, and we'll move on. Like, it just starts to feel the same. It's harder to put your mind around things as we form memories. And so in verse 10, the teacher's recognizing that this brief blip in time is his life. And so even with all the busyness of the business that God has given to him, it doesn't seem to last, and it's astoundingly brief in the scope of eternity. Well, so I'm burdened to help us understand how small our lives are. And I don't mean this in a depressing way, but this is what the teacher's getting after. So how brief is our life? Well, I think there's some ways I can maybe try to help us explain it. So let's do this. Let's thought experiment. If we were to just take from the time of Christ till now, so roughly 2,000 years, and we were to imagine that timeline as a rope or a steel cable stretched out just 20 feet, right? So we have a 20-foot long steel cable, and that's going to represent time just since Christ. Well, in that 20-foot long table, each century then roughly represents a foot, right? 12 inches. So 100 years for about every foot as we go along through time, right? So then the problem is this is our life in that scope of time. Like, you come, you die, you're gone. I'm not trying to be mean, but most of us are not going to be remembered very well if you fast forward 100 years from now. Despite the bill of goods they tried to sell me as a kid, right? I'm not going to grow up and be famous, write some astounding book that everybody's going to read, and 100 years from now they're going to be impressed by. And what's interesting is even if you are one of those people, like say you're Charles Simeon, and pastors today are astoundingly moved and encouraged by, as he worked through the trials of life, he didn't know any of that was going to happen while he lived. Jonathan Edwards had no clue he would be the premier theologian of the United States when he was alive. Like, people just don't understand. And so it's really shockingly brief. But the problem is that doesn't give us even a bigger scope within the world. And so let's just think if we looked at the cross-section of that same steel cable, and we're trying to figure out our influence in the midst of that 20-foot long or so chain. Well, what if every one of our lives represent just a fiber of that steel cable? So I was trying to figure out like the impact of my life in the midst of all that's going on in the world right now. And so what if every fiber was really just the size of a human hair? So this is what you represent. You represent that tiny section of that 20-foot long steel cable, and you are the size of one hair that makes up that steel cable. Well, how big would that cable have to be? What would the diameter be to capture it, to understand your influence? That cable would have to be 4 miles in diameter. And you and I represent a human hair's worth of steel in the middle of that long cable. This is the sense that the teacher gets. I am pointless. And all the work I've done, what's it matter? What's the point of all of it? And how does it affect anything? And somebody's going to just come behind me and redo what I've done anyway. And so in the blips of life, the first thing he says is he reflects on this reality. God, though, will make everything beautiful in its time. That word beautiful, there's such a semantic range there. It could be everything right in its time. It could be everything appropriate in its time. It's capturing the sense of putting the last puzzle piece in a massively complex puzzle. Isn't that always a fun moment? When I was a kid, I was always tempted, if our family was working on puzzles, lots of times over the holidays we'd work on puzzles, I always wanted to take one of the pieces and hide it. And so one time I did. And we got to the end of the puzzle, and I was so angry because there was 3 pieces missing. Well, I knew where one was, but I was so mad there were 2 other ones missing. And one of them was lost, and another one had also been secretly pocketed by someone else. How dare they rob me of that delight? There's just some weird delight about putting the last puzzle piece in, isn't there? It's that idea. It's putting the last piece in the puzzle. It's a masterpiece, putting the last brushstroke. It's putting the last stitch in an astoundingly complex quilt. It's putting the last nail in a beautiful piece of wood craftsmanship. Part of our creation design is God has put eternity into our hearts. You see, I don't think it would bother us as much to understand that I'm just a tiny blip in time if I didn't understand the reality that there was always something before and there will always be something after. And so my brevity seems that much more painful and oppressive and like a cage because I know everything will go on forever. And this isn't it. And he's getting this idea of there'll be eternity. And so the teacher first tells us, take a deep breath. Because in the midst of feeling very pointless, like one hair-thin fiber and a 4.5 mile wide steel cable, God will take your travail. He will take your suffering, your struggling, your working, your tears and your laughter. And he will one day perfectly use them to put the pieces in the puzzle of lives and purpose and meaning and of value. And so at first creation, we were going to be eternal in the sense that we would never die. We were going to quest for something beyond us. We understood from Adam and Eve in the garden that the work they were doing was intended to last forever. And yet now, because of sin, we're all going to die. And most of what we do here will not last, and yet God will make it right in its time. Second truth is this helps to make sense of the senselessness of life. Though we are aware of time, the struggle for us is we can't perceive all he's doing right now. We can't fully envision how he's going to use these things or what he will do with them. Yeah, he's put eternity in our heart, yet so that we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I cannot tell you how frequently I'm asked this question. What's the point of this suffering? Why this sorrowing? You know, I've never had somebody ask me that question about a blessing. I've never had somebody come to me and say, I just got a promotion and a new raise. Steve, can I meet with you? What's the point of this? I don't think the least of which, because frankly, I think most of the time we operate out of a sense of entitlement. Like, I got that promotion and that raise because I earned it. I've never had someone come to me and say, why has God suddenly just made my wife and I fertile and she's pregnant? What a joy. Why would he do that? And yet I've had many come, why would God not give us children? You see, I think it's most commonly in the seasons of sorrow and struggle that we start to evaluate and to think. And I'm not condemning that. I think that's exactly how it works. That's why later in Ecclesiastes, he will say it's better to go in the house of mourning than in the house of mirth, because it's better that we contemplate. And that's why Moses says to consider and number our days. And so how do we make sense of all this senselessness? Commonly, we land somewhere between sincere gratitude for what God has done and rightful expectation if it's a blessing. If it's a sorrow, a difficulty, or trial, we commonly ask, where did this come from? Why is this happening to me? And how in the world does this fit into God's bigger plan? And the teacher is telling us something that none of us want to hear. There will be, frankly, some things on this earth in our time we will simply not get. And God is not in the business of unveiling the full tapestry of the glory of his creation while we're here. There's a limit to what we can explain, describe, unpack, and understand. And this is what the teacher is saying to us. And so then the rest of his evaluation is, how do we respond to that? I'm so thankful because Solomon makes my job easy as a preacher, because he starts to then tell you, what do I do with all that? So here I have this poem that I've written. It's beautiful, and it captures all of life. And now I've communicated kind of the frustration and where this really boils down to. And so then how do I respond to that, or what do I do with it? And then we will start to see how his reflection upon that leads him to joy and to worship. And so all that reality I've just said should lead you to delight in life and worship God. How can that happen? And how would we understand that? Well, there's 3 commands, 3 ways. First of all, we should take pleasure in the gifts of life. Okay, so verse 12, I'm going to start reading there, and I'm going to read down through verse 15. We'll get all 3 of them. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Now, in just a moment, we're going to connect 12 and 15. You'll see how they lead together. That's going to be one. The next one that we'll start with, just for sake of flow and clarity, is verse 13. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. That should sound very familiar to you. That was what he said we should do in chapter 2. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear or reverence before him. That's worship. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. And so he comes back to the cycle. So the first thing I want you to think about is, how should I respond to this sense of pointlessness, this cycle of life, that my life is really very little different from somebody 1,000 years ago, or if God tarries, what it will be 1,000 years from now. There will be people living and dying, and there will be people working and resting and laughing and sorrowing, and there will be sin and there will be deliverance. What in the world do I do with that? He says, take pleasure in the gifts of life that God has given to you. Specifically, though, he says it interesting, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. Now, he uses toil, yes, to reference work, but more than work. He uses toil to think of all of your life. So all of your life is a gift, but again, the part we struggle with the most is the working part of it. People aren't struggling with the really enjoyable gifts. They're not struggling with the gifts of raises and promotions. So when someone says, take pleasure in your raise and your promotion, people are like, well, yes, amen. God from on high has given me all wonderful things. But if I say, take pleasure in all your toil, including being laid off, hearing a bad diagnosis about your uncle, that's a little harder. Take pleasure and joy in what God has given and think of work as a gift? How do we understand that? And so let's just go after what's hardest. I remember growing up, I had one older relative one time told me, enjoy my childhood. The terrible day was coming when I was going to have to work. And I was a little boy, I'm going to be honest, that made no sense to me. Because I was the kid that could not wait to be older, that could not wait to be at the next season of life, that was always eagerly anticipating the next thing. I loved when my dad came home from the electromotive division at General Motors, and I didn't know what the smell was. I now know what the smell was. But it was the smell of machine oil, because essentially it was a machine shop where they repaired locomotives. My dad was an electrician and worked in the machine shop. So you work in a machine shop all day, you smell like machine oil. I didn't understand what that was. I'll tell you what it smelled like to me. It smelled like to me the cologne of a hardworking, loving dad that I wanted to be like. So I would run and want to hug him, wrestle with him, spend time with him. I wanted to smell like my dad because I wanted to be a man. We'd go out and work on the car. I wanted my hands to be greasy and dirty. I didn't want to just hand tools. So sometimes when I was handing my dad tools and he was doing a brake job, I'm going to be honest here, if he said, don't touch that, Stephen, it's very dusty, and he would turn his head and I'd be like. So I could come in, put Gojo on my fingers and scrub my fingernails. So someone to tell me that I should take pleasure in Peter Pan living because work was coming made no sense to me. I wanted to work. Then I got older. And then I started to realize thorns and thistles happen when you work. And then I started to realize that being a construction guy and hanging and wearing a tool belt and having a screw gun in your pocket and it being about 10 degrees outside, up on a lift 25 feet in the air, putting in a new Hamrick's sign that involved me having to screw in the steel metal and sticking my hand in my bag and doing this, and then suddenly realizing I have all these screws literally stuck into my fingers because my hand was so numb I couldn't feel them. Or I'd spend my whole day in the summertime hanging insulation in a firewall, and I'd get home and I'd go to take a shower, and if I held my arm right, you could see the glass fibers sticking in your arm. Suddenly work wasn't so cool anymore. And thorns and thistles happen. So how is work good? And how is it gift? I will give you 4 ways. Work is a gift because it images him. God works. God is not this long, white-haired, austere being sitting pie in the sky. He works. If he were to take his time or his mind and his attention off of anything and everything that's happening right now, the universe would cease to exist. Particles and molecules would fly apart. He holds it together. By him, all things exist, and we say it theologically, they consist. He has made it and spoken it, and now he holds it compactly together. He works, and so he has given us gift as a work. It's work as a gift because it images him. It's why my daughter wanted a kitchen and all these little toy foods. Melissa and Doug, they made this cool pizza. It was all Velcroed together in a pizza cutter, and you could cut it. Because she wanted to work like her mommy works. That's why my sons wanted toy lawnmowers and toy drills and toy hammers and toy weed eaters. One of our boys one year for his birthday, I think all he got was a helmet and safety vest and weed eater and glove, and he was thrilled because he was a worker man. Why? Because they desperately love their parents and they want to be like them. Don't you understand? Work is God's gift to you because it helps you be like him. I think the more we fight against the concept of work, we're actually fighting against the way God has created us in the imago Dei, the image of God imprinted upon us. It's why many people, when they cease working, if they don't find other ways to work, they degrade mentally. I'm not saying it has to be the same work always. Seasons of life shift. But there must always be a productivity and a work. God has made us this way. So it's a gift. Work is a gift because it connects us to understanding him better. It's not just imaging him, but suddenly we understand the travail and the hardship. Do you think you think God has never experienced the concept of deep investment emotionally, physically, volitionally into people's lives, into situations, only to have it turn out bad? Now, God in his sovereignty knows that's going to happen. He's in control of it. But isn't he the same God who created this whole world in 6 days, sat back to rest, said, it is all good? And we don't know when. Everybody has a different time frame. But let's just say within a year, his precious children that he comes and visits with every day defy him in the one thing he said not to do, turn their attention, and act like he's this malicious God they have to hide in the bushes from. Do you think he comprehends then what it's like for you and I when we pour our lives into something, whether that's physical labor, whether it's mental work, whether it's discipleship, parenting, whatever it is, only to see it not come to success like we would want? Yes, he understands it, and guess what? In that moment, it gives you a deeper comprehension of him. That's a gift. I mean, don't you want to know Jesus better? Well, then don't you realize that to know Jesus better, you have to know what it's like to spend 30 years as a carpenter? Everybody say, what good thing can come from Nazareth? You have to work. You have to invest in people's lives to preach and have 20,000 there only for them to walk away from you if you fed them a banquet lunch because he said you have to eat of me and drink of me. He knows what it's like to pour life into work, to have people walk away, to have it not seem to be successful, to have it not come to fruition, to work your whole life at a workplace, retire, go back to visit, and it's like they don't even remember who you were. He understands, and it actually helps us to understand him better. I think thirdly, work is a gift because work done right is worship, and it's rewarded. And no matter what you and I do, we do it for the glory of God. He is glorified. And so I'll just give you one very, very quick illustration. Spiritually, he says in ministry work, because we're primarily here in church together, so we think about it this way. All of us are called to do lives of ministry, and many times we feel like the ministry we do is small or meaningless or pointless or not fruitful. We are prone or tempted to think the ministry I can do has little effect. We might think that me just praying has little effect. We might just think my little giving has little effect. My greeting, my warm greeting, my helping to take care of the grounds or the sound or play instrument, like that's little. God is maybe something very little, and yet he's the same one that said if you just took a cup of cold water and gave it to somebody in his name, will he not richly reward you in heaven? Now, I don't know how God will do it, and I'm certainly the last one that's going to tell God how to do it, but I do think it'd be really cool at Bema Seat reward time if God suddenly said, this is cold water moment. And he's like, Joe Smith, come here. And Joe is completely stunned. Because that's the way Christ tells the story. Completely shocked. What? Do you remember that time that you were walking through church and you saw that trash laying on the ground? And you picked it up and you thought, somebody else shouldn't have to do that. Let me go ahead and pick that up and throw that away. And Joe's like, yeah? Thank you so much for caring about the rest of the people that were around you and loving them more than you and wanting to serve them instead of have them serve you. I mean, how cool will it be to have cold water season? Because all these little things even that we do, those little moments, mom or dad, when you look at that child and you're speaking to them and it's family devotion times and you feel like you're okay, take your finger out of your nose. Okay, now stop doing this. Sit still, please. Okay, we're just trying to read from the Jesus Storybook Bible. Can we just get through this? And yet God is recognizing as you're doing that out of a heart to want to glorify him and disciple your kids, all those throwaway moments are for his glory and his kingdom, and he looks at that work and he will reward it richly. Work is a gift. We should delight in that. And then lastly, work is God's gift because some good work actually even draws others to him. Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men, and do your good works that they may see them, and what? Glorify your Father in heaven. That's how you should respond. And none of us know which of those works it is, do we? And yet part of his means of drawing people to salvation is by as they see the love and affection believers have for one another, and as they see the good works that we do, they would start to ask questions and be like, what are you doing? Because just to be very, very clear, handing someone money or doing a good work and serving your neighbor, those are wonderful things. They do need to actually hear the gospel. But a means of drawing them to the point of wanting to listen to the gospel are the very good works that we do. Work is a gift, isn't it? It's thorns and thistles, but it is a gift. And so we should take pleasure in the gift. And secondarily, it should drive us to worship God. We should reverence God. Verse 14, he puts it this way. I perceived that whatever God does, whatever he does, right, like all my work is temporal. It's going to go away. It's going to fade away. It's going to fall down. But I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear or reverence, worship before him. Fear of the Lord is another common focus as you work through Ecclesiastes and certainly through Proverbs. The fear of the Lord, the reverence of God is the beginning of wisdom. Revelation 15, I love how it captures. It's called the Song of the Lamb. One day we'll sing this together. I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image, and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. And this is how the song begins. Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. What he's telling us is that there will come a day in his sovereignty that we will see that final puzzle piece, and we'll see the backside of the tapestry. You see the front of a tapestry, and you see the image, but the backside of a tapestry is just seems like a mishmash confusion of threads. And there will come a time when all we feel like we see is that mishmash of threads. What's the point of this? How does this fit in? And God will flip it, and we will see it, and we will be stunned and amazed. I'm shocked we'll be able to sing, because otherwise we'd be so silenced in reverence and awe of all that he has done and woven together that you and I could not see. You know, the opposite of reverence is to put demands on God. It's easy for us to do specifically in the realm of sovereignty. You know, as the teacher's working through this, I've seen all the business that God has given to children of man to be busy with. What's the point of all of this? He's going to make it beautiful in his time, but he's put eternity in my heart, and yet I can't find out what he's doing. And we're tempted with this sense of frustration over his sovereignty. And this is not uncommon. You can think of it even in a Romans 9 context. People want to know, well, how exactly does this whole, how's election work? And it's clear God's choosing who he's going to save, but then how does this happen? And what does it look like? And various ways people will begin to struggle, and they'll become frustrated. He says it's not based on what man wills or does or how he runs. It's based on his own grace and mercy. Yet why does he give mercy to some and not to others? And sometimes when we're wrestling with why is God doing this, or why is this his plan, we can actually begin to judge him. We can actually begin to say, well, that's not fair. Your plan isn't right. Because we're trapped in time and we can't see the fullness of it. In Romans 9, it actually goes to this point in verses 19 and 20. You will say to me then, why does he find fault? Or who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? The teacher is wise, and he recognizes that one response to the sense of the futility of life, to turn, is to get angry and judge God as not being good and not knowing what he's doing. And he must, because I can't figure it out, he must not have it figured out. The teacher knows that we crave to understand meaning for our labor and sorrow and our trials right now. Hosea would have desperately wanted to know, in the middle of the struggle, what is the value of this struggle? How will this ever be made beautiful in its time, as the verse says? What is the sense in this senselessness? But as I heard H.B. Charles Jr. say this past week, the revealing of the value of our ministries will not be at the end of today, but at the end of our lives. And so we worship and trust in the meantime. And so then that leads to the third, well, actually, Charles Bridges. Charles Bridges is a great Puritan pastor. He actually says it this way: if we can't alter the sovereign plans of God, and I'm modernizing the language here a little bit for us, but if we can't alter God's sovereign plans, let's set ourselves down to the more profitable work of altering our judgment of God's plans. And so rather than us sitting on the condemning, and we can't change it, let's change the way we think about it. Well, how do we do that? And that does lead us to our third command here, and it's when we link verses 12 and 15 together. So let's point at that, and we'll be all done this morning. I perceive there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live. And I'm just going to connect it because I think they support one another. Verse 15, that which is already has been. That which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. What he is saying there is not only are there the cycles of life, but get this now, everything you see God doing as we look through the cycles of life remains the same. Now, that is the support for you to have joy and to do good. And you say, how? Hosea could have looked at the struggles and been like the teacher and said, what's the point? Certainly, it's the common response of all of our hearts. Charles Bridges actually goes on in his own commentary in Ecclesiastes, and he points it this way with Christians. Some Christians are so shallow in their knowledge of their Bibles that when they start to go through seasons of trials, and it doesn't matter what that is, that can be economic, that can be relational, that can be physical, that can be workplace, community-based, and they start to go through trials, and Charles Bridges is pointing out how some Christians just seem shocked by this. And he says it this way: they think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try them, as though some strange thing had happened to them. He's referencing 1 Peter 4:13, as though none had ever wrestled through, as they've been called to do. The reality is this: the cycles of life help me to actually understand my suffering in the midst of life. Because when I start getting my attention off of trying to judge what God's doing, I can then be asking, well, what has God done before? Because isn't he the same God yesterday, today, and forever? And so how has God responded to suffering Christians? And how has God spoken into the sorrows of my life? And how has God ministered into the loneliness of my struggle? How can we have joy and do good in the midst of all these things? Because the cycle of life actually serves us. And we can do it by taking the command of verse 12, put it with the truth of verse 15, and be reminded God is operating in the same way that he has in the past, and he will continue to work in the same ways in the future. And there's a New Testament text to show you. So go to 2 Peter. And you can see that this is exactly what Peter relies upon to communicate this truth. In 2 Peter chapter 2, look at what he says to the people as he's writing to them. And I'll just give brief commentary as we go along. We won't take super long here, but just think of cycles of life. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Do you realize he has just now gone from before creation, falling of the angels, to the first worldwide judgment, to specific judgment? Have your heart ever wondered, what in the world is God doing with all the injustice in our season of life? The answer is then go back and look at the cycles of life and be reminded, God don't let things go. He deals with unrighteousness. And if he rescued the righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over the lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. Whereas angels, though greater in might and power, Do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also all be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. He goes on and on and on. You know what he's telling us? Whether it's in 1 Peter and 2 Peter, he's saying this, believer, don't be shocked by the sufferings. This is the cycles of life. But also be encouraged and worship God. He deals justly. He gives comfort. He wipes away tears. As his children, we ask him for bread and fish. He does not give us gravel and serpents. The cycles of life can lead us to greater rejoicing and worship and joy, because in the cycles of life, we also see the cycles of God's grace. One thing you could do this week is take one of those common cyclical historical ways God has worked and think through how you have seen God's character and power. Maybe you're struggling with a season of physical suffering, and you would ask, well then, God, help me to see in the cycles of life how you have dealt with those that are suffering. Help me to see your kindness in the Gospels. Help me to see your tenderness towards Job. Help me to see your grace and mercy to the infertile and to the struggling. Maybe you're struggling with a sense of injustice. God, help me to see how you deal justly in your time. You could go back and begin to refresh your heart about the character and the nature of God as you've seen him work. Your joy in moving forward and doing good must not be based on the full awareness of how your suffering and struggle fits within the greater tapestry of God's sovereignty. But rather, your joy in doing good is based upon the fact that you serve the same God from yesterday, today, and forever. And he will use this as a masterpiece of his glory. In other words, you get all the way to the end of Hosea. Hosea, if there's any prophet that should have been confused about what God is doing, and these are the last words we hear from him. In Hosea 14:9, whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. And as you and I rest in the cyclical nature of life, suddenly these futile cycles of life drive us to joy and worship as we reflect on God's rule over all of life. May we respond as the righteous in the midst of confusing seasons and not as transgressors. Father, we thank you that you are a rescuer and a redeemer, a lover of souls, a kind and gentle God. Lord, we ask that you would help us to see your mercy. Father, our hearts crave to know the full meaning and fruitfulness of all that's happening. And yet, the reality that Ecclesiastes unpacks is there are simply many things we will not know. And so, God, would you embolden us by the power of your Spirit in the season of not knowing, to yet find joy and delight in the gifts you've given, to worship you and rejoice in what you're accomplishing, and to trust your sovereign hand as from a loving God. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.